Modern English translations of the Old Testament are based on Hebrew and Aramaic texts. Unfortunately, we don't have the originals of those texts. And so, what we have to do is piece together, based off of the manuscripts that we have, our best understanding of what the earliest versions of the Bible looked like. And the process of doing that is called textual criticism. And so in this video, I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what text criticism is. And so let's just dive right into it. This is going to cover chapter 1 from Emanuel Tov's book on textual criticism. Emanuel Tov is a world-class scholar. He's one of the premier authorities on how to do text criticism of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, as it's often referred to. So let's just look into it. So what is textual criticism? It's the attempt to reconstruct the earliest forms of the text. And you do that by looking at all the ancient witnesses of the text. And then also we're trying to explain why the text developed as it did. All right, so this is a lot to take in, so let's break it down. So like I said, we don't have the original forms of any book of the Bible. And so what we're trying to do is look through ancient manuscripts to understand what the earliest versions looked like. And we'll explain why we need to do that in just a minute. And then, of course, we're going to explain how the text and why it developed as it did. So this is the whole process, or the whole goal, I should say, of text criticism. All right, so why do we need text criticism to begin with? Well, the reality is that we see differences between every single manuscript that we have. Okay, this is just the way when you go and look at the ancient documents from the medieval period all the way back to the earliest ones we have, many of them are incomplete. And then even the ones that are complete, we find differences between them. Now, we see mistakes, corrections, and changes in the text. And this is included in something that's called the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text is the version that is sort of the most dominant version of the Hebrew Bible. It's the one that your English translation is based on. And so we see evidence, right, where the scribes were making small mistakes. Now, here's the reality. Is today this doesn't make sense to us because we can scan a picture of a book and get a perfect copy. But prior to digital scanners, you had to either, type up a new typeface, if we're talking about in the printing age, and there were mistakes made just by typos and things like that. But then if we go even further back, prior to the printing press, you had to literally hand copy everything. And so it was much easier to make mistakes. And so we can see just basic evidence, just using basic logic of, when a word is misspelled, or when a line is actually skipped, or a phrase is skipped. And even in some of these ancient documents, we can see sort of in the margins a note that tells you where a word was supposed to go. And so this is just something that we can actually observe. And so the other reason that we need textual criticism is we know that the Masoretic text, which is this dominant form that we use most often, is not equivalent to the original text. Okay, so the version of the Bible that you read is, like I said, is most often translated based on the Masoretic text. And if you ever catch those little footnotes that most Bibles will have, it will tell you where another ancient manuscript says something different. And so that other manuscript is often not the Masoretic text. And so we know that the Masoretic text is actually not equivalent to the original text. And then finally, the fourth reason we need textual criticism is that we see differences within inner biblical quotations. Now, we'll have to explore that a little bit more in just a few minutes. So let's dive into these 4 topics. Okay, so we see differences between every manuscript. Okay, we have no 100% uniform text prior to digital photocopies. And the printing press used different medieval manuscripts. So you might think that once we got the printing press, then mistakes disappeared. But the reality is that different printing presses were actually using different manuscripts in order to bring the Hebrew Bible into wider circulation. And that actually means that even though the printing press was much more efficient, it actually brought forward mistakes that were already in the text. We see a wide variety of differences even in the Masoretic text after the printing press is invented because of this. And here's a few of the types of differences that we see just after the printing press. We see differences in book sequence. Uh, Chapters are divided differently. Sometimes a passage is laid out as prose, sometimes it's laid out as poetry. Then where they divide the verses differs. Then, of course, we see mistakes with letters and words. And then Hebrew has a system of vocalization and accents, and those can differ between different traditions. And then, of course, we see differences that are based on reading the same manuscript. Sometimes you just couldn't read the handwriting as well as you'd like. And so one person might see a particular letter and another person might see a different letter. And you interpret that differently. And then you put that into the printing press in a more readable version. And that's how mistakes enter. And then, of course, there's just basic printing errors that could happen. So that's why we need textual criticism, because we see differences between the manuscripts in all these different ways. Second, we see mistakes, corrections, and changes in the text, and this includes that dominant form of the Masoretic text. Text corruption is an inescapable fact in human history, right? If you've ever tried to type any document at length, you know you'll make mistakes. Even if the Masoretes, and the Masoretes were scribes who painstakingly translated the Hebrew Bible in the Middle Ages, and they're the ones who are behind what we call the Masoretic text, which is this dominant form of the Hebrew text. That even if they were perfect, and we know that they weren't, even if they were perfect, they could only perfectly preserve an imperfect text tradition. Okay, so the manuscripts that they were working from were in fact themselves imperfect. And here are some reasons why that's the case. Is that we were transitioning, the Hebrew was transitioning between different scripts. There was literally a different way of writing. If you've ever gone back and looked at ancient English, you won't be able to read some of it because it's just written differently. And then, of course, there's also just examples of not great handwriting, bad handwriting. And then in Hebrew, there are some letters that just look the same. And so it's hard to differentiate them at times. And of course, sometimes a scribe that wrote it might have squished letters together because of space constraints. And so then it becomes difficult to know exactly where one word begins and another word ends. And then, of course, Hebrew is, prior to this Middle Age period, had no official system of vocalization. It's a consonantal language, which means the letters are all consonants, and you just sort of know what vowels are supposed to be there. And then in the Middle Ages, the Masoretes actually developed a system for these vowels. Well, there's disagreement prior to that about how these words should be pronounced. And then, of course, there's also maybe perhaps a scribe made a correction to a misspelling that then the next generation of scribes didn't understand, and so they made another mistake. So these are things that are inescapable and that we can actually observe in these ancient documents. The third reason we need textual criticism is that we know the Masoretic text is not the original text. Well, original, and put that in quotes because it's hard to know exactly what the original might even mean. Evidence from Qumran, which is where we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament from before the time of Jesus, shows that there were multiple versions of Old Testament books in existence, right? So in Jeremiah, between the Septuagint and the Hebrew versions that we know of, there's a significant length difference between the two books, right? The Greek version and the Hebrew version actually have different material included in them, and the length differs. And so that's a really fascinating development. And we see that in some other books as well, though Jeremiah is one of the more extreme examples. Most modern translations, though, are reliant on the Masoretic text, with only occasional footnotes marking differences. And so you open your English Bible and you will find predominantly a reflection of the Masoretic text. And so that leads to the assumption or the presupposition that the Masoretic text is somehow the dominant form, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the original. Okay, so it may be the most common form, but that doesn't necessarily mean it reflects the original in every situation. Now, again, I don't want to overplay this. There is remarkable consistency between what we find in most medieval texts and what we can reconstruct about the earliest forms of the text. There is remarkable consistency, but there is also some interesting differences that we need to be aware of. Fourth reason we need textual criticism is that we see differences within the interbiblical quotations. Okay, so sometimes the Bible quotes itself, and this is most obvious in the book of Chronicles, which is using Samuel and Kings and even some other, a number of other books from the Old Testament. When later biblical books quote or utilize earlier biblical books, we sometimes see the later book using a version that is different from the Masoretic text. Okay, so when we read Kings, we read a version of Kings that looks like the Masoretic text. Okay, this is how modern translations work. When we read Chronicles, we're actually reading a text that is using a slightly different version of Kings than the one that we read, which is just fascinating. And which tells us that when the book of Chronicles is being written, that the book of Kings that was in existence, in whatever form it existed, was actually slightly different, right? And so that it was still in some development, and we can observe this. If you ever just get out 2 copies of the Bible and read Chronicles and Kings together and really pay attention to, like, wait, Chronicles is saying this, but in that same story in Kings, it's saying something slightly different. There are times when it's apparent that actually the text that Chronicles was looking at for its material is actually slightly different than the text that we're looking at with Kings, which just creates really some interesting and fun questions to explore. So we can think of it like this. We have First Chronicles, our MT, our Masoretic text. You might think it was translated from the First Kings MT, but in fact, it's translated from the First Kings not MT, okay? So it's looking at the one that we actually don't have in order to create its story. So that's just a fascinating development. So once more, what is textual criticism? It's the attempt to reconstruct the earliest forms of the text by analyzing the differences between all the ancient texts that we have. And it's the attempt to explain why the text developed the ways that it did. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. It's can be a really interesting and complicated topic, I admit, but it's fascinating nonetheless. I'm going to provide more lectures about text criticism based on Emanuel Tov's book. This is a way of me getting a better grasp on the whole field, and hopefully it's also a way for you to be introduced to the topic even more. If you're interested in this type of information, I hope that you'll subscribe for more.